Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Gray Matter. Well, I'm going to start off today with a cliche. The interesting thing about cliches is that they're trite, but they're also true. And the one I'm going to cite today is that there are only two certainties in life: death and taxes. Well, under the federal liberals, there's one more certainty, and that is that the taxes will go higher and higher, and that life will become increasingly expensive to the point where people can no longer afford to do the things that they need to do in their daily lives. So today, to talk about taxes, we have somebody from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. His name is Jay Goldberg. He's an executive director with the CTF. And we're looking forward to a conversation with him and learning more about some of the things that are going on in Canada fiscally, especially the activities of our government, which is setting all-time Olympic records in government spending. Unprecedented is the word. That word's probably overused, but in this context, it might be one where it is the most apt. Anyway, before we get to Jay and introduce him properly, as we always do, we're going to go to the aphorisms board. And as you might expect, some of the ones that we've chosen today have particular application to taxation. The first one is from Winston Churchill, who was famously quoted as saying many things, but this is something that he actually said, and that is that I contend that for a nation to try to tax itself into prosperity is like a man standing in a bucket and trying to lift himself up by the handle. I would contend that man was probably a Canadian. The second one is from an American economist of some renown. His name is Dr. Thomas Sowell. He's at Princeton. And he once wrote, well, he's written many things, and you should check out his books. They're all great. But he once wrote that elections should be held in April, the day after we pay our income taxes. That is one of the few things that might discourage politicians from being big spenders. How true. The next one is from former U.S. president from the 20th century, Calvin Coolidge, who said that collecting more taxes than is absolutely necessary is legalized robbery. If that's true, then the people running our country are bona fide robber barons. The last one is from Mark Twain, the famous American author from the 19th century. What is the difference between a taxidermist, that's someone who stuffs animals, and a tax collector? Well, the difference is the taxidermist takes only your skin. All right, so who do we have on the program? Mr. Jay Goldberg. He is the Ontario Director and Interim Atlantic Director for the CTF, Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Jay joined them in that capacity last year. He spent most of his career in academia, where he was most recently a policy fellow at the Munk School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. For those who don't know, that's a very esteemed think tank, if you will. Jay was motivated to leave academia and join the CTF after seeing the consequences of high taxes, high deficits, and government waste on everyday Canadians. That's admirable. Jay grew up in Toronto and spent some time living in Vancouver. He currently lives in Guelph with his wife, Carolyn. He is an avid reader of history and enjoys spending time with his dogs, Winston and Lincoln. I'm going to guess that those are named after famous people who are often quoted on this show. Jay holds an honors bachelor degree in political science from the University of Toronto and a master's of arts degree in political science from the University of British Columbia. Well, I've been looking forward to this conversation for some time. As you might know, I'm associated with a think tank myself, the Frontier Center for Public Policy. And there are some, let's say, alumni from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation within the Frontier. And but I haven't yet had somebody like you on the program who can talk sort of high-level tax policy and what's going on in Canada. As you can imagine, many Canadians are very concerned about the spending of this government, the cost of daily life, what's going on, not only with income taxes going up, but of course, carbon taxes. We have another carbon tax on the way. People in Western Canada are very concerned about some of the restrictions on the use of fertilizer and what appears to be, well, what Danielle Smith, who's the front runner for the premiership of Alberta, is calling the National Energy Policy 2.0. So let's start with this. In the news, there's 190 million in bonuses given to federal executives and upper management in 2021. This seems to be obscene on the heels of what Canadians have been going through in the pandemic. What are your thoughts about this idea that those in the public service just seem to keep getting raises while everybody, or most people in the private sector, are suffering?
Well, it's been really a tale of two pandemics as we've gone through about 3 years of this now. It's been job losses, losses of hours at work for average folks, and then people in government, in many cases, working less during the pandemic, getting pay raises and bonuses, and giving out bonuses at this time is really a slap in the face to Canadian taxpayers. We've had people who were out of work during the pandemic through lockdowns or for other reasons, job losses. We're seeing some job growth now, but we're also seeing inflation far outpacing wage growth. And so people all across the country are suffering from high taxes and high spending. And we can certainly talk about later how the high government spending is leading to more printing at the Bank of Canada, which is leading to higher inflation. That's a tax on every one of us all throughout this country. So it's been a tale of two pandemics, and it really is just the public sector, which we call just government employees. Public sector is too generous of a word, but government employees being treated completely different from everyone else in the private sector who is paying for their paychecks. Frankly, there shouldn't be any bonuses going out while there's such a pay gap of over 10% between what people make when they're working in the private sector and what people make when they're working for government.
Mm-hmm. Jake, coming back to this idea of the increases in government spending and this job growth, I read somewhere that the federal government or government in Canada is now the #1 employer in Canada. Is that true?
There's been a huge amount of growth in government jobs since the pandemic. Well over half of the jobs that we've created since the pandemic began have been government jobs. And so, the government does like to run around and tout the lower unemployment rate, but certainly a lot of that has to do with people who have been getting jobs with the government, which again puts more stress on our public finances because we know, for example, at the provincial level, over half of what the provincial government spends has to do with the salaries of people who are employed by the province. And, the numbers aren't all that different at the federal level. So definitely all this extra hiring, first of all, artificially makes it look like the employment situation is better than it is. Because frankly, you can't just run around the country and hire every single person to work for the government. You'd have a 0% unemployment rate, but you wouldn't be able to pay their paychecks. And so that's exactly the problem. And so the solution, of course, is not to create more government jobs, it's to create more private sector jobs. And the way to do that is to lower taxes, to tamp down on government spending, and just allow for growth without excessive regulation. All three of those things seem to be things that the Trudeau government just doesn't know how to do.
Right. So this points back to an article that you published in the Toronto Sun last year, where you wrote that that we should let the stimulus come from taxpayers and not from governments. Is that kind of what you meant when you wrote that piece for the Toronto Sun?
Well, absolutely, because if you think about it in two ways, the government during the pandemic decided that they wanted to spend tens of billions of dollars to supposedly keep the economy going. And they were throwing it around for all kinds of various projects. And what I was saying at the time, and what I continue to say, is that if you lower taxes and put more money in people's wallets, they can then go out and buy the things they need to buy, fill up their gas tank that they need to fill out, that they desperately can't fill up because of these record high gas prices, to pay for grocery bills. Family grocery bills this year are $1,000 more than they were last year. And so what I was saying is, let the stimulus come from taxpayers, leave more money in their wallets. They will buy the things that they need, and that will help to move the economy forward. We don't need more government spending. We need more money in people's pockets so that they can be the ones, the people can be the ones who fuel an economic recovery.
Jay, when we talk about these things like inflation and interest rates and higher gas prices, I realize you're not an economist, but you're steeped in this stuff. I wonder if you could just bring us down to ground level and explain kind of the relationship between inflation and taxes and how inflation actually works as a form of tax on everyday people.
Sure. So inflation is the idea of too much money in the economy chasing too few goods. Basically, since the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, the Bank of Canada has been printing money left, right, and center, and they've really accelerated that throughout the pandemic. The Trudeau government ran deficits of hundreds of billions of dollars, and that was financed through the Bank of Canada printing hundreds of billions of dollars of extra money. So all that new money is flooding into the system, and when you have too few goods and all kinds of money, that just pushes up prices. And so that's why we've seen such significant inflation. It's happening in Canada, it's happening in other countries too, because central banks were printing money like crazy to try to finance the record deficits that governments were running, the reckless deficits and record deficits that governments were running. And so we're seeing inflation here in Canada in large part because the Bank of Canada printed all kinds of money to finance the Trudeau government's deficits. And so if we really want to get back to a place where we can control inflation, the number one thing to do is stop running deficits, because that's just putting more money into the economy. And we need to stop that now. The consequence of all of that extra money being printed and spent is that prices are going up. So individuals, we can't afford to buy things anymore. Everything's getting more expensive.
You actually predicted this, Jay, when I did some of the research on some of the pieces you'd published back in March of this year. Towards the end of March, you had published a piece stating, this is in Business Entrepreneur's Eye in Canada, you'd published a piece where you predicted that the Liberal NDP deal, this unholy alliance, would mean major tax hikes. So what was the basis for that prediction?
Well, the basis for that prediction is simple. The government at the federal level has been running record deficits for years now. And at a time when spending had to be reduced, because as you're getting out of COVID, I mean, the government used the pandemic as an excuse to spend all kinds of extra money, some of it perhaps warranted, much of it not. But the government then decided to make a deal with the NDP to bring in literally hundreds of billions of dollars of new spending in order for the NDP to promise to keep the Liberals in power until 2025. And so the Liberals basically agreed to a huge, massive amount of spending that was absolutely unaffordable. It's still unaffordable, but they've agreed to create all these new massive government programs without any way to pay for it other than tax hikes. And so that's the natural outcome when you have government already running a massive deficit, planning to bring in these programs that cost hundreds of billions of dollars. That's exactly why you're going to see tax hikes. And I said that at the time, and that's what we are seeing.
Jay, this appears to prove Einstein's definition of insanity. That is, doing the same thing over and over again and seeing the same results, but not learning anything. Why are governments, in particular the federal government, why are they not learning from this and seeing the feedback that's coming from the economy and changing course?
Well, look, our government here, especially at the federal level, appears to be very tone deaf to what's going on. I mean, my colleague Franco Terrazzano has published work showing that over 50 countries around the world, have been cutting taxes to help individuals try to deal with the inflation and the high cost of living as we are now. And the Trudeau government has refused to come out and do that. They literally came out and announced that they were going to try to fight inflation through spending an extra several $billion, which is exactly what got us into the inflation problem in the first place. So the Trudeau government actually appears to be uniquely tone deaf to this. We've had governments around the world offering tax cuts. We've had gas tax cuts here in Ontario, in Newfoundland, and Alberta. So governments are, in some parts, figuring out that all of this extra spending, years and years of crazy government spending, actually is not the answer. And the answer may be spend less, put more money in people's pockets. But the federal government in particular seems to not want to heed that advice at all. They just seem like an ostrich with their head buried in the sand and just do not want to see what's going on in the world.
I noticed that the newly elected leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, Pierre Poilievre, was very critical of the Prime Minister on this very point in question period recently, made the point that you just made, that the government should be focusing on tax breaks for Canadians in order to alleviate some of the pressure that's on everyday Canadians in terms of affording their lives. Is it fair to say that the Canadian Taxpayers Federation is supportive of that part of the Conservatives' platform at the moment?
Well, the CTF is going to support the position of any party that's going to put more money back in people's wallets, especially at this time. And so, yeah, Mr. Poilievre has come out with several ideas, including scrapping the carbon tax, which is something that we've advocated for a long time, making sure we don't get a second carbon tax, which the Trudeau government is planning and is in the pipeline. So definitely when Mr. Poilievre comes out and makes pro-taxpayer announcements, we're going to be on his side on that. As we would with any party, but certainly a lot of what he's come up with has been positive.
Mm-hmm. So I noticed, or I noted also, Jay, that there was a story that ran this week where the Liberals were boasting that they've recorded a $6.33 billion budget surplus in the first part of the 2022-23 fiscal year. But based on what you said off camera, any hope that they've turned a corner and changed their course on fiscal management would be a vain hope. Is that fair to say?
Well, yeah, and let me start out by saying governments at the provincial level across the country have been running surpluses. Even here in Ontario, we had a shock surplus that came out very recently. But it's important to explain why this surplus is happening. It's not because governments are being more responsible in terms of spending. It has a lot to do with inflation, because if you think about it, prices are going up on everything we buy. HST is charged on everything we buy. If prices are higher, then the HST as a percentage of whatever the cost is, the money that's going to go to the government is actually more. So governments are bringing in all kinds of extra money because of inflation and because things are more expensive. And so that's one of the reasons why you're seeing more government revenue. And it's not that they're being very responsible with their expenses. They're not. It's that there has been more revenue, and that's because government's profiting on the back of inflation. But as I said as well, usually governments, their numbers are pretty good in the first few months of a fiscal year, but we tend to have in Ottawa what's called March Madness, and that's not the basketball term or a sports term. That's actually referencing the fact that in the last month of the fiscal year in Ottawa, usually all kinds of money is spent, billions and billions, more than what's spent during the rest of the year. So even if you get into the last few months of the fiscal year and things are looking pretty good, usually you end up with a significant deficit in March that will bring them into deficit territory. Any sign of a potential surplus, that's nice, but you have to look at the fundamentals, not just the number, but is spending really going down? And the answer is no. Is this sustainable? The answer is no. So, they might try to tout that, but they're not doing what they need to do to get into a sound fiscal position moving forward and to get to a balanced budget.
So the position of the CTF would be governments really shouldn't have surpluses. That's a sign that they're collecting too much, and that money would be much better off in the hands of Canadians and circulating through the economy as opposed to being in the hands of government. Is that a fair analysis?
Well, I mean, certainly having a surplus can be a good thing. It depends what you're going to do with the surplus. First of all, you need to see a balanced budget. Governments are not so precise that they can introduce a budget that's going to have a tiny, tiny, tiny surplus and just hope that the budget's going to work out all throughout the year. So planning for a surplus is fine. The question is, what do you do with the surplus? And number one, the surplus should be used either to reduce the taxation burden on Canadians or to help pay down the debt or both. And so what we've seen under the Trudeau government is actually more debt has been added by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau than all of the previous prime ministers combined. And he's literally doubled the national debt. And so if we were to get a federal surplus, which certainly the government's not pursuing the kind of policies that they need to pursue to get there. But if we were to see a federal surplus, what should be done with the money? Well, definitely to reduce the tax burden on Canadians and also to pay down the debt. Those would be the two highest priorities.
Well, the one thing we can be certain of is that the deficit is not going to be paid down from royalties earned from Justin Trudeau's new singing career. But in terms of new taxes, I note that Trudeau is looking at a wealth tax to pay for soaring spending. This was noted in May of this year, and sure enough, this has come to pass. So has this wealth tax come into effect yet, and why is it bad for the economy?
So the Trudeau government hasn't officially implemented a wealth tax as of yet, but they've said that they're looking at it. The NDP is very much in favor of a wealth tax, and of course, the Liberals are relying on the NDP to stay in government for the next few years. They've also committed, the Liberals have, hundreds of billions of dollars in new spending to help create that deal with the NDP. And a wealth tax would be a primary way that they're likely looking to pay for it. And what this would mean is that this is going to hit people all across the country. Sometimes a wealth tax might sound like a nice idea, but a wealth tax ends up hurting everyone, particularly because here in Canada, real estate value is so high that if you start to tax wealth, average families are going to get hurt. You've got farmers who are going to get hammered because on paper they might have a lot of wealth in terms of farm equipment and the land that they happen to have. But in reality, they're not, they don't have millions and millions and millions of dollars just sitting in a bank account. And so a wealth tax has never worked where it's been tried. It does not make sense to bring it here, especially when you're trying to fuel economic growth, not kill economic growth. And so wealth tax would be a terrible idea. It would hurt families. It would hurt families that have used their primary home to save up money to be able to build a nest egg for their retirement. It would hurt farmers. And it would just make Canada very uncompetitive. Everybody who's wealthy, usually people who are very wealthy, happen to be able to be mobile, or at least their money can be mobile. And this will just encourage people to leave their money outside of Canada. So that's just going to, it'll be a flop altogether. So wealth tax, it would damage the economy. It would chase wealthy taxpayers out of the country. And if you have wealthy taxpayers leave the country, that also means that they're not here to pay income taxes every year. So if you happen to lose those people, your tax base might shrink as well. So it's just a bad idea all around.
One of the other ones that has come into effect recently, I believe at the beginning of September, Jay, is this luxury tax. For example, on vehicles that are more than $100,000. This is a really bad idea too, because it discourages people who have money from spending it in the economy. Why is this luxury tax bad for the economy?
Well, the biggest concern is workers. They've placed a luxury tax on cars, on certain boats and planes. Look, in the United States, under the George H.W. Bush administration in the early 90s, the U.S. did impose certain wealth taxes. 250,000 people who worked in the boating industry lost their jobs. And so this is not just a question about, trying to make some kind of fancy car more expensive for wealthy people. This is a question about, well, what are the people who are employed in these industries going to do if this tax discourages wealthy people from buying boats or planes or cars? And so in the United States, to go back to that example, the Clinton administration, the Democratic administration that came after the Bush administration, actually made sure that the wealth taxes were repealed in the United States because of how much, not the wealth, but the luxury taxes were repealed in the United States. And they were repealed because the Democratic administration recognized that it caused the loss of hundreds of thousands of jobs. And so we don't want to see the same thing here, where you have people who work in the automobile industry, the boating industry, the plane industry, losing their jobs because of a new tax, and that's the big concern.
This sounds like a good example of the idea that whenever you have a complex system and you try to tweak it in a way, let's say because you think that you have an idea that is a panacea, that is a cure-all, what usually ends up happening is that complex system that tends to work let's say half the time, is damaged by the new idea. And then you have all kinds of new problems that are created by what you've injected in the complex system. And this is a good example of what you're talking about. It sounds on the surface like, oh yeah, let's just have this luxury tax and we'll hit these fat cats who want to drive Land Rovers and Mercedes. But nobody seems to realize the impact that you're talking about. How is that going to impact all the workers who work in those factories, the salespeople, the car detailers, and all the way down through the economy, when that flow of money through that system is even slightly reduced. So this is a great example of the fiscal policy that our prime minister has decided he's not interested in. Okay, speaking of liberal bad ideas, here's one that I know you're very interested in, and that is how Trudeau's censorship law is going to impact Canadians. Now, on the surface of it, this doesn't sound like it has an economic impact, but that's not true once you sort of get past the veneer, is it?
No, it's not. And, this is a really dangerous bill. Bill C-11 is the censorship bill that the Trudeau government is currently pursuing. Again, the government claims that the bill, that they're doing it for the sake of online creators, they're doing it for the sake of promoting Canadian content. In reality, it's hurting the very people that they say they want to help, and then it's going to hurt all Canadians in the process. So essentially, the Liberals want the power to control the internet, to censor what we're putting online and filter what we're putting online and what we're able to see and say online. So what Bill C-11 does is give power to the CRTC. It's a government agency, the power to filter what we're seeing online. So what the government is claiming is they want to do this to push Canadian content forward, so that when you're online, if you're on YouTube or TikTok or streaming things, that the Canadian content will come up first. But that means you are giving a government agency the power to filter and choose the order in which we see things online. They say right now they're only going to tell the CRTC to do that for the purposes of whether or not something counts as Canadian. But in the future, they could do that for any other reason. They are putting the infrastructure in place to allow for a government agency to filter what we see online for whatever reason the government wants. Right now, they're saying it's just for the sake of Canadian content. In the future, it could be for the sake of silencing the government's critics. So that's a huge concern. In terms of how it's going to affect individual Canadians, well, first of all, the CRTC does a really bad job in deciding what's Canadian. So we have there's a series that was made on Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale. It's been well reviewed online. Of course, she's a very famous Canadian author. A lot of it was filmed in the GTA, and yet because its producers are in the United States, the CRTC counts it as American content, and it's not counted as Canadian content. And so under the government C-11 bill, this content would be deprioritized in our streaming feeds, even though we would generally consider it to be Canadian. There's also a film called Gotta Love Trump. It's a biopic of the Trump presidency. It's considered to be Canadian because some of the production was in BC and some of the footage was shot in BC. And so the CRTC right now doesn't even know how to figure out what's Canadian. And yet they're saying they're going to filter our feeds to decide what we should see or what we shouldn't see based on what they think is Canadian. So first of all, they already don't know how to do what they're doing. But second of all, do we really want to give these people 100 times as much power as they have now if they can't figure out what they're doing now? And then, there's the mission creep concern, as I said before, that you're giving an agency the power to filter what we see online. You're saying you're doing it for one reason, but the government, through a simple order in council, through simple instruction or regulation, could tell them to do it for any other reason. So that's why Bill C-11 is so dangerous, because it sets a terrible precedent. It puts this law on the books that really would censor Canadians, gives the government the power to do so, and they could snap their fingers and put it into place at any time to expand beyond just Canadian content to stuff that is simply critical of the government. So that's why it's such a dangerous bill.
Speaking of government-funded media or publicly funded media that is under government control, let's talk about the CBC. Does the CTF support the defunding of the CBC?
Absolutely. Yeah. The CBC costs taxpayers over $1 billion a year. I mean, it's one of the biggest money holes or money pits that you've ever seen, really, in Canada. It's unbelievable the amount of money that's flooded into the CBC. And of course, they still get ad revenue and they can't make their model work. I mean, if there's Canadian content that people want to watch, they'll watch it. The CBC, yes, they put some Canadian content up there, but so do others. Netflix has invested over $1 billion in creating more Canadian content. And so the argument that we somehow need the CBC to protect Canadian content, it really doesn't hold water, because Canadian content will succeed if it's stuff that people want to watch. And now that we have online streaming, now that we have these services like Netflix, Canadian content can get to people more easily than ever before. And that's just a further indication of why the CBC isn't needed. And again, we are wasting over $1 billion a year on this government run news source and entertainment source that's just not doing well. It's got a poor business model, and there's no way taxpayers should be on the hook to have to pay all these bills.
The last stat I saw was that 96% of CBC revenue comes from the public purse, and yet only about 1% of Canadians are watching it. So these are not good metrics for Canadian taxpayers, are they?
No, they're horrible metrics for Canadian taxpayers. And look, there's no way we should be paying for this. Other countries don't have the same thing. Even in the UK, the BBC is there, but it's pared down. It's very focused on the news. It's also they don't have commercials. So the idea that somehow the CBC can't survive on its own, even though they can have ad revenue and have been having ad revenue for a long time, just shows you how undesirable really the network is to Canadians. Because if the CBC is so great, if it has great content, if they've got a good business model, then the CBC should be able to sink or float on its own without any taxpayer dollars. And the fact that they're not willing to try that or do that or get anywhere close to not wasting tons of taxpayer money every year just shows you that the CBC, it's just a failing organization that should not be getting taxpayer dollars.
Another topic of concern that's related is the government sponsorship of private media, quote unquote private media.
Yeah.
And this has been very much become a public concern during the COVID-19 pandemic, where no matter what channel you turn to in the mass media, the same government promulgated messages were being sent out. Is the CTF concerned about this, and does it support the cessation of government-sponsored private media payouts?
Yes, we are concerned about it. It's obviously calls into question the independence of certain media sources, but it's also a huge waste of taxpayer money. There's all kinds of alternative news that is figuring out new business models. They're succeeding, they're breaking through, and alternative news online sources, whether it's the Western Standard or True North or other places, are breaking through, and they're operating completely independent of any government money. And that's the way that it should be. There's no way that we should be using taxpayer dollars to hold up these failing news organizations. Again, similar to the CBC, they should sink or float on their own. If they can succeed, if they have a business model, if they can have the ad revenue, that's fantastic. Let them move forward. But there's absolutely no way we should be spending taxpayer dollars to hold up these organizations that clearly can't support themselves. And what that indicates is there's just not enough public interest. There's not enough Canadian interest in these organizations. So look, if they cannot survive through the business model, through a successful business model without government support, then clearly they shouldn't be. They're not the kind of organization that's going to survive. We need to have fully independent press in Canada. That means allowing the media to be fully at arm's length from the government, and that means none of them should be taking a dollar of public money so that they can properly cover news stories, that they can properly hold the government to account, and so that Canadians can choose the organizations, the news organizations that they want to listen to, that they want to trust, and they should put their time and money and effort in there. And so absolutely, the CTF completely is against this media bailout. We were gratified to hear that that's one thing that Mr. Poilievre said that he would want to scrap if he becomes prime minister, and it absolutely should be scrapped as soon as possible.
It's even bad for the media outlets themselves, isn't it? I saw a story recently that Global News had published that they are in, even though they've received massive government handouts, they're still broke. They still cannot afford to maintain their business model. And so what's happening is that instead of being a business that is flexible and agile and adjusting to the market the way it ought to be, and becoming leaner, becoming better, innovating, getting better content, they just keep plowing on in the way that they have been, and that's causing people not to watch their programming and going with their hands out to government. So it's really bad for those media outlets as well, isn't it?
Well, it is. And I mean, if you think about it, if an organization, we've seen this with the CBC, and now we're seeing it with these other media outlets, if they're becoming entirely or significantly dependent on government money, they start to take that for granted. Taxpayer dollars going to these organizations, and that all of a sudden works itself into their model. And so, all of a sudden, these organizations think, okay, we have this amount of money that we can count on getting from taxpayers, so we don't have to innovate, we don't have to be flexible, we don't have to make the changes we need to make to be self-sufficient. And so that's exactly right. It's causing these organizations to become dependent on taxpayer dollars, which is then making them complacent, not willing to make the necessary adjustments they need to make to survive in today's news market. And so ultimately, in the end, it's bad news for these companies that are taking the money, because it's just, making them completely dependent on public money, not innovating properly, and it just becomes cyclical. They need more and more money because they're continuously not innovating. And so it just goes in circles and circles and circles until the organizations completely fail or become completely dependent on taxpayer dollars. And, you don't want to see either of those in this country. Media organizations should stay fully independent. They should not take taxpayer dollars, and they should innovate in the way that they need to do to keep up with today's market and today's news market. As I said, other independent media is doing it. They're figuring out how to do it. They're doing it quite well. And traditional media should follow suit. They should not be taking money from the taxpayer.
Well, Jay, we talked earlier about wealth taxes and luxury taxes and why they're bad for the economy and therefore bad for Canadians. But of course, this government's appetite, I should say the federal and provincial government's appetite for new taxes goes beyond just the rich, but also extends to the poor in the form of sin taxes. So that, for example, in Newfoundland, they've instituted a soda pop tax, basically a tax on sugar, and many provincial governments are talking about increasing taxes on liquor. So this is really bad for the economy too, isn't it? Because it preys on the most vulnerable Canadians, doesn't it?
Well, and let me just talk about the Newfoundland Labrador situation in particular, because I've been covering the Atlantic desk as well with the CTF. And I mean, it's just incredible what the paternalistic government is trying to do over there. So essentially what they're doing, as you said, there's a tax, but it's only on like sugary drinks, sugary pops. So a can of Coke, it's getting this extra tax. Essentially every liter is getting an extra 20 cents tax for the sugary pop, which comes out to about $1 for every case of pop that you buy. Regular pop, that's a heck of a lot of money, number one. Number two, how in the world do you implement this? Think about if you go to McDonald's and you order a combo meal that comes with a drink. Is there going to be an extra little slot machine on the fountain around the corner when you're filling up your drink if you happen to put it under the regular Coke instead of the Diet Coke category? It just makes no sense. It can't be implemented. And then think of this. If you go over to Dairy Queen and get a Blizzard, a regular sized Blizzard has, say 10 times as much sugar as a can of Coke. Well, the government's not putting a special tax in on that. So people can consume sugar in other ways that are still unhealthy, They're just not having to be, it's not a Coke, it's not a Pepsi, but it's all kinds of sugary ice cream, and there's not a tax there. So it really, the government, their plan, this tax is not going to have the effect that they're hoping it will, because they're taxing one kind of sugar consumption but not the other. It's incredibly hard to implement. It's being charged at the wholesale level, so people don't even fully know exactly how much they're paying because of this tax. But as I said, there's so many other ways people can consume sugar that's more sugar than these sugary drinks. And so it makes absolutely no sense. And yes, when you want to talk about alcohol, let's talk about the federal government. They have an escalator tax in place. The Liberals voted in 2017. And what it does is it automatically raises the taxes on alcohol every year. An escalator tax is a tax by stealth, because politicians don't have to stand up and vote in the House of Commons every year to hike the tax. It's just pre-scheduled. And so over half of what you spend on a can of beer is tax. Over something like 65% of the cost of wine is tax, and over 3/4 of the cost of things like tequila and vodka is tax. So you're paying more in taxes than you actually are to get the alcohol that you want to get. And again, these escalator taxes are very dangerous taxes, because government doesn't have to stand up and vote to raise your taxes every year. They're just raised automatically, and that's a very dangerous thing.
I saw recently a meme out of Quebec, Jay. You might have seen this. It was on the internet, and it purported to state that someone earning $1 million in the province of Quebec at the end of the day would end up remitting 51.4% of that $1 million to various federal and provincial taxes. This seems to me to be obscene in a country that is founded on freedom and democracy, and on a free market, essentially for a free market economy. Is this sort of thing sustainable? And if not, what can we do? What can we do to let these governments know that enough's enough? We want to keep our money in our own pocketbooks.
Listen, it's not at all sustainable. There's no way that somebody should be working more for the government than for themselves. And that's exactly what it would be in that situation you just pointed out in Quebec. There's no way that should happen. The reality is that particularly people who are wealthy, if they're making $1 million a year, most of these people can work from anywhere they want. They can work from Toronto, they can work from Montreal, they can also work from Tampa Bay, they can work for anywhere all around the world, go to Dubai. A lot of people can move. And so one of the huge risks is if you have taxes that are just so high on wealthy people, they will flee, they will move to other countries and bring their wealth with them. And then we won't be getting income tax revenue every year. So if you're trying to raise income taxes by a few points to hit people even harder, if you lose all these wealthy taxpayers to somewhere else, your tax revenue is actually going to go down. And so this is a bad thing for governments to do. We have seen examples in history where taxes have been lowered, but government revenue has gone up. And that's because it encourages people to work more. It encourages wealthier people to come to these areas with lower taxes. And so Canadians need to stand up and absolutely tell their governments, and, email your MP, email your local, if you're in Ontario, MPP, if you're elsewhere, your MLA, email the federal government in particular, Minister Freeland, and say enough is enough. We want to be a place where we can work more for ourselves, to better our family situation, than we are working for the government. There's no way that someone should be working more for the government than for themselves. And, you're just going to chase all these wealthier taxpayers away. They can leave, and we're all going to be stuck paying even higher taxes, because we're losing the people who paid the most taxes. And so it's just completely wrong-headed. And right now, at a time when the economy is not doing as well as it should be, at a time when inflation is out of control, the cost of living is out of control, we should not be seeing the $1 of tax hikes. We should be seeing tax cuts. That's what we're seeing in so many other countries around the world. We're not seeing it in Canada at the federal level, and that's a huge disappointment.
It seems counterintuitive, what you just said, but I know that a few years ago, when Donald Trump brought in a tax cut, it actually resulted in a significant increase in tax revenue. And I guess part of that would be that people will spend less money on tax avoidance if they think that the amount of tax that they're being charged is reasonable. Is that a fair characterization, or has that been borne out by the data?
Well, I mean, first of all, people will definitely, you'll have lower tax avoidance if tax rates are lower. That's just, common sense, but also it's been borne out in evidence. But in terms of why tax revenue could be higher, tax revenue could be higher because people all of a sudden are willing to work these extra hours or pick up that extra shift that they didn't want to pick up, because otherwise they would have been pushed into a higher tax bracket and it just wasn't worth it. I remember growing up, my mom, she worked 4 days a week, dental hygienist, and she said to me, look, if I worked 5 days a week, the amount of extra money I'd be getting after taxes is so minuscule that there's just no reason for me to work that extra day. And so there's so many people who think like that. And so, yes, if you do lower tax rates, then you do encourage people to work more and to want to work more, to enter the workforce. And actually, in the United States, after those Trump tax cuts, one of the other things you saw was a growing workforce participation rate, because more people wanted to come back into the workforce because they were excited to see the possibility that a lot of what they earned, they'd be able to keep. And so that was very important. But also we saw under the Harper government, there were corporate tax cuts that they brought in. And everybody on the left, particularly the NDP at the time, was saying, you're just throwing money away to corporations. We're going to lose all kinds of tax dollars. This is a terrible thing to do. And what happened? Corporate tax revenue went up every year when those tax cuts were put in place. And that's because you had more companies moving to Canada, investing more in Canada, spending and earning more in Canada. And so that is why you can at times have tax cuts generate more economic growth, which then generates more tax revenue.
This has also macroeconomic and political implications in terms of increased taxes, and we're seeing this in Alberta in terms of Western alienation. I saw a message this morning from the Danielle Smith campaign talking about the National Energy Policy 2.0, saying that this new program that's coming from Ottawa, these attacks, this windfall profits tax on the energy sector, is going to have huge impacts in terms of loss of tens of thousands of jobs and billions in investment. So this type of this sort of short-sighted fiscal policy is also manifesting itself in terms of the Canadian political scene too, isn't it?
Yes, and provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan have been mistreated in this federation for a long time. And the resource potential that we have here in Canada is being stifled by things like the No More Pipelines law that the Liberals passed, by killing pipelines whether they were going to go east through the Eastward Expansion Project or through British Columbia. I mean, the Trudeau government is killing any new resource development in Canada, essentially. And look, that would unlock billions and billions of dollars in tax revenue, in economic growth, in jobs. But these provinces have been stifled. And I think it's very important to say, some people like to think that if you don't develop oil in, say, Alberta, you don't develop natural gas, that somehow that's just going to help the environment, stuff will stay in the ground, and that's all. Well, the reality is much of Eastern Canada does not get oil from Alberta or Saskatchewan. It's coming from Venezuela, it's coming from the Middle East, and you can bet that the development of oil and natural gas in other countries, particularly countries in the Middle East, in South America, it's not being done nearly as responsibly or with as much thought to improving the environmental situation as in Canada. So we actually have cleaner and more ethical energy that we could be producing in Western Canada for Eastern Canada, and instead, in Eastern Canada, we're importing it from other countries, from dictatorships, from countries that don't really care about the environment in the same way that we do in terms of sustainable practices. So number one, it just makes no sense that we are, on the one hand, stopping energy resource development in Western Canada, but at the same time, importing energy, oil and natural gas from abroad, instead of using the things that we have at home that could generate economic growth, that would be more environmentally responsible, and that will create more jobs and more tax revenue in Canada. So yes, it's manifesting itself in our really bad energy policies we have in Canada. It's leading to less tax revenue and less economic growth and fewer jobs. And it is leading to political tension throughout the country. And I think that's only going to continue as we go forward. As you know, we're hearing the windfall profits tax that you mentioned, but also all of these laws that are blocking pipeline development, forcing oil to go by rail, which is really hurting our farmers. I mean, there's just so many consequences that come from these really wrong-headed energy policies that are hurting taxpayers and governments all across the country.
You make a great point, one that's not made enough, about the extent to which the Canadian energy sector is the most environmentally conscious in the world. I wish that our prime minister and our government would talk about that more and trumpet that more internationally, instead of constantly vilifying our energy sector around the world. But there are signs that some premiers are fighting back. I noticed a piece that you wrote at the end of August about Nova Scotia premier fighting back against the massive federal carbon tax. Do you want to talk about a little bit about what's happening in Nova Scotia?
Absolutely. You know, so Justin Trudeau, the federal government, they claim everything they're doing is motivated for the sake of the environment. Well, if you look at the data, the federal government's goal for emissions by 2030 is to reduce it by 40% under 2005 levels. Well, Nova Scotia, without the Trudeau carbon tax, has already done 36% of that 40%. The Nova Scotia as a province is leading the nation in reducing greenhouse gases, and yet the Trudeau government is preparing to force a carbon tax on drivers in Nova Scotia and taxpayers there. Right now, they have a cap and trade system. Now, that's not a perfect system by any means, but it has caused gas prices to increase by 1 cent per liter. The Trudeau carbon tax has caused gas prices to increase by 11 cents a liter, and that will go all the way up past 40 cents a liter by the time we get to 2030. But Nova Scotia has been leading the country in reducing emissions without the Trudeau carbon tax. And the reason that the Trudeau government is trying to impose it on Nova Scotia, I think, is because they don't want to see an example of improving environmental outcomes without using their dangerous and very costly carbon tax at the federal level. I mean, what they're imposing on provinces like Alberta and Ontario, it's just robbery. And I should add, the federal government keeps coming out and saying that the average household is going to be getting more back in these rebates than we're paying. But the PBO, Parliamentary Budget Officer, they've done work, and they're an independent entity at the federal level. And they're saying that in Alberta, Ontario, elsewhere, families will be getting thousands of dollars less in rebates than they are paying in carbon taxes when you're filling up your car with home heating and all of that. So the government is not telling the truth when it comes to claiming that people are going to get more money back than they're paying when it comes to the carbon tax. But they're also trying to kill the environmental strategy in Nova Scotia that they're pursuing, because it's showing that you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions without the costly federal carbon tax. And the Trudeau government doesn't seem to want to let that happen.
Jay, there's a great section on your website, on the CTF website, called Mythbusters. If you wouldn't mind, I'd like to take you through a few of these, because I think
Sure.
they'd be of great interest to people taking this in. The first one is, who do we owe our federal debt to?
We owe our federal debt a lot of places, but a lot of it is foreign bondholders. A lot of it has to do with countries abroad. Of course, some of it is Canadians themselves have bought bonds in the debt market. But we've doubled the national debt over the period of the last 7 or so years. We're in a fiscal situation that we've never been in before, where we're owing so much money and spending almost $40 billion a year on debt interest. And so it's a very dangerous situation. And a lot of countries throughout the Western world owe a lot of debt to countries like China and places like China. And so, that's not a place where you want to be. And so that's all the more reason why deficits in these countries and just racking up the debt is so alarming.
One of the other ones on here is ask the question, how much does Canada spend on foreign aid? Many Canadians I know are very generous people. I think Canada is one of the most generous countries in the world. but they're questioning, well, with our country so far in debt, ought we to be sending money around the world? Can we afford to do that if we can't even take care of our own people? What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, I think foreign aid has to be evaluated in each individual circumstance. Some of it could be merited and some may not be merited. But, the government has to get its fiscal house in order. And if part of that means doing a very serious review of where we're sending foreign aid, then I think that should be part of that process. Obviously, there's some situations that are, I think, more warranting of foreign aid than others. I think that in some cases, if you look at individual elements, and if you look how the government actually administers foreign aid and the money that's wasted in terms of administration and bureaucracy, there's concerns there as well. But yes, when you're in such a bad fiscal situation as Canada is, there's no question that we should do a serious evaluation of every dollar we're spending in foreign aid. And if it's not accomplishing what it's meant to accomplish, and if it's not doing something that's incredibly important, then it needs to be reevaluated. There's no question.
Douglas Murray is a British author who's written a series of excellent books. One of them is called The Strange Death of Europe. In that book, if you've read it, you'll know he tracks the sort of migration of refugees throughout Europe. And there's an interesting pattern that most of them tend to go to the countries that have the most generous social welfare systems. And so one of the questions that Canadians are asking is, for example, are refugees entitled to more government support than pensioners, for example? Is this of concern to the Canadian Tax Federation?
Well, I mean, obviously, Canada is a country that has welcomed refugees and immigrants as well. I think that things need to be evaluated on an individual case-by-case basis when it comes to refugees, particularly because some of them are fleeing very dangerous circumstances. But I do think that again, you need to look at government policy as a whole and make sure that what we're doing is working for Canada. And I think a lot of politicians in many parties have pointed out that we have huge shortages in Canada. We have huge labor shortages in certain sectors. We have people who are doctors and nurses from abroad who want to come here and be doctors and nurses. And so government bureaucracy is standing in the way of that. And so the best case scenario is bringing in immigrants and refugees who will actually be contributing to our economy, filling holes that we need to have filled. And instead of focusing on, money that's being paid out through the government, through taxpayers, we can focus on how they can contribute to our economy. And so I think government needs to do a very serious look at skilled immigration in particular. And premiers all across the country have been saying this. There are people who want to come here who can fill a lot of holes that we have in Canada. And so certainly that's something that needs to be prioritized when you're talking about things like immigration and migration.
I think it's absolutely true that Canada needs immigrants. We're a country of mostly immigrants, and they are a great strength of the country. So I quite agree with that position. Here's one that you might giggle at, but a lot of people ask this question: why doesn't the Bank of Canada print money to pay off our national debt?
Well, if they printed the money to try to pay off the national debt, of course we'd be getting more and more inflation because our national debt is well over $1 trillion. So the Bank of Canada, can't do that, because then essentially the value of the Canadian dollar would plummet. We wouldn't be able to buy stuff from anywhere else in the world because, frankly, you see countries like Venezuela where the government has been trying to print money to try to pay off debt that they owe to foreign debtors. And all that's done is lowered the value of their currency, and the cost to import anything is incredibly expensive. So if the Bank of Canada were to do that, the value of our money in our bank accounts would go down because the Canadian dollar would be worth way less. And so our life savings would be wiped out if the Bank of Canada were to print more than $1 trillion. And that is why inflation is so dangerous, because that's what it is. It's government running deficits, the Bank of Canada printing money to fund those deficits. And then the value of our money is going down. It can't buy as much as it used to want to buy. And that is why inflation becomes a tax on us. So if the Bank of Canada were to print 1.2, 1.3 trillion dollars, we would just see our savings, our life savings, flood away because the Canadian dollar would be worth virtually nothing.
One of the really ingenious ideas that the CTF has come up with is the debt clock. Could you explain about the debt clock a little bit? I know many people are interested in this and how it works.
Definitely. So what we do is for too many people, the concept of the debt that we owe is just, it's hard to imagine. 1.2 trillion. What does that mean? So with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we have websites that show, first of all, the debt growing in real time, so you can see that within the span of minutes, our national debt is going up by millions and millions of dollars. You can watch it live, but it also shows you exactly where the debt is. And one of the great parts about our debt clock is that it also shows how much each individual Canadian owes. Because of course, if you break down the national debt, 1.2 trillion, by the amount of people that are here, you actually find out that each one of us, including a baby born yesterday, owes $30,000 in federal debt. And if you happen to live in Ontario, you owe another $30,000 in provincial debt. So one of the great things that we do with the debt clock is to make people aware of just how much money we owe, but also just how much money an individual owes. And so, $60,000, that is a heck of a lot of money. It's doubled over the past 7-8 years. It's out of control. And that's why we need to put a stop to it. And that's why we need governments to stop running deficits, start balancing their budgets, running surpluses, get that clock stopped. The best thing we want to see at the CTF is for our debt clock to stop. Unfortunately, governments aren't expecting to do that anytime in the near future. But, I remain optimistic that hopefully one day we get some smart folks into government who start to balance the budget. And actually, I should give a shout out to Premier Blaine Higgs in New Brunswick. He has actually been reducing New Brunswick's debt. So the debt clock in New Brunswick has stopped. It is going in reverse. So it's not an impossible thing to do, but it takes leadership and it takes courage. And that's something certainly we haven't seen from the Trudeau government in Ottawa.
Mm-hmm. Amen to that. So the babies that you talked about being born with this debt burden, they would be part of what the CTF calls Generation Screwed, I take it. That's the idea.
They would be. That's exactly it. And so Generation Screwed is an organization that's associated with the Taxpayers Federation that we created to try to make young people in particular aware of everything they're being saddled with. Because people who are 60, 65 years old, spending that's going on today, yes, maybe higher interest rates it's impacting what the deficit is per se. But these burdens, all the money that's being borrowed right now is going to have to be paid back by the next generation. So what we want to do is make sure people at the university level and young Canadians are fully aware that the decisions politicians of today are making are just saddling them with tens of thousands of dollars of debt that they're going to have to pay back in future years. And so the people who should be most concerned about governments running debt and running up deficits, the debt growing, the fact that our national debt has doubled in the last 6 or 7 years, the people who should be most concerned is young Canadians, because they're the ones that are going to have to pay those bills. The people who are in power making decisions now, they're going to be retired, and and Prime Minister Trudeau is going to be at some point retired and enjoying vacations and enjoying his retirement, and it'll be future generations, people who are in university now, young families who are going to be paying the bills that he's racking up right now. So that's why we have Generation Screwed, to make people aware and just to really spread the message among young people that the decisions that adults are making today are affecting your future tomorrow. And that's why it's so important to have an organization like Generation Screwed.
Speaking of young people, it's also a very bad idea for them to be entitled to universal basic income too, isn't it?
Universal basic income, it's a very bad idea, and there's two problems associated with it. First of all, it would cost, there have been studies that have been done at the federal level, it could cost more than $100 billion a year right now we have a federal deficit of $50 billion. You're talking $100 billion a year. That's a ton of money that would, balloon the national debt. And if you wanted to actually pay for that, you would have to hike taxes so incredibly high that, the sales tax would have to be doubled and then some to pay for this. The other thing is, you have some people traditionally there have been some people on what might be called the political right who have come up, who have proposed or been proponents of this idea that you could have a basic national minimum income. But what they have said is it should be a replacement for all of the other federal government programs, whether you're talking about welfare or disability payments or all of these other things at the federal level. The proponents who were on the right were saying, let's bring in a universal basic income and get rid of all these other government programs. Well, when the NDP and the Liberals talk about universal basic income, they're not talking about getting rid of the other costly government programs. They're just talking about adding this on top of all the other costly government programs. So they're not even having the conversation that people who came up with UBI in the beginning were saying, well, this could be a way to replace other programs, and perhaps, it would be costly, but it wouldn't be as costly as, say, what the current proponents are saying. If you look at what Jagmeet Singh is saying, he wants a universal basic income, but he wants to keep every other social welfare program that we have in Canada intact. And that's not what the UBI idea was originally designed to do. And that's why it's so incredibly unaffordable. We are already paying tens of billions of dollars for welfare and disability and all these other programs here in Canada. To add another one would be incredibly irresponsible.
Well, that I quite agree. Jay, as you can probably tell, I've prepared for this carefully, and I hit you with a lot of topics. You've covered them all beautifully. I want to thank you so much for being with us today. This is the part of the program where we turn to something called the reading list. Before we do that, I wonder if you could point people, how do people find you if they want to learn more about the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, if they want to donate, for example, to some of the projects that you folks are working on? How would they do that? How would they get in touch with you?
Well, the best way would be to go to taxpayer.com. You would see our contact information there in the About section for any of the directors. You would also see the petitions that we're working on. And let me just say, petitions are so important because it means the world when we can go to politicians and say, tens of thousands of Canadians have signed our petition against government censorship, or have signed our petition calling on any level of government to reduce taxes or to scrap the carbon tax. It really gives weight behind what we try to do. And so signing petitions is very, very important. Of course, donations are great as well. But you can follow us as well. You can sign up as a supporter, and then you'll get our action updates where we update people on what's going on in all kinds of issues that affect them, whether it's government censorship or the carbon tax or what's being done to our oil and natural gas sector. So I would encourage people to go to taxpayer.com. That's the best place to find more information about the organization.
Well, I've signed a few of your petitions, and I'll continue to do so. So let's talk about the reading list. I've got a couple of books that I'm going to recommend. One is called Trickle-Down Theory and Tax Cuts for the Rich. This is a book that is, again, written by Thomas Sowell, who I talked about in the opening. I think is probably the greatest living economist in terms of the depth and breadth of things that he's written about. He's written more books after the age of 80 than most people have read, which is a pity, but just a wonderful author. And this one really explodes many myths that people think about how tax cuts for the rich actually work and how they impact the economy. And of course, Jay has helped to elaborate about some of those myths and dispel some of them during our conversation today. The second book is also from Thomas Sowell, and this one is called Economic Facts and Fallacies. And in this one, it's designed for people who want to understand economic issues without getting bogged down in jargon, graphs, or political rhetoric. It's written in a lively manner, does not require any prior knowledge of economics, exposes some of the popular fallacies about economic issues, including that many that are widely disseminated in the media by politicians, fallacies about urban problems, income differences, male, female, economic differences, academia, race, and third world countries. These fallacies are not just crazy ideas. They are very much in the public parlance, and it's what many politicians are basing their campaigns upon. And the last book I have is one called Liberal Fascism, The Secret History of the American Left from Mussolini onward. And this one, it offers a startling new perspective on the theories and practices that define fascist politics, replacing conveniently manufactured myths with surprising and enlightening research. Goldberg reminds us that the original fascists were really on the left, and that liberals from Woodrow Wilson to Franklin Roosevelt to Hillary Clinton have advocated policies and principles remarkably similar to those of Hitler's National Socialism and Mussolini's fascism. Before some of you think that I'm putting on my tinfoil hat, the concept of fascism is grossly misunderstood, and we are to some degree seeing it in Canada, because fascism fundamentally is about government collaborating with, and in some ways conspiring with, big business and media. And that's in a lot of ways what we're seeing in Canada, really for the first time, certainly the first time in my lifetime. And so this book gives you a sense of how that works. And this is a word that's thrown around so much. And I think it's important to understand really what fascism is and how it's at work in some degree in Canada today. So those are the books that I'd recommend. Do you have any that you'd like to point to, Jay, being the very learned man that you are?
Well, I'm a big fan of reading some Milton Friedman books, that's for sure. And also, and honestly, it's not a personal plug by any means, but we put out an ebook called on Bill C-11, and we call it The Dangerous Gateway to Government Censorship. And you can find it on taxpayer.com. But what we really tried to do, we worked with Professor Dr. Geist from the University of Ottawa to lay out the case for how Bill C-11, the government's current censorship bill, it's being considered before the Senate right now, exactly how it will impact everyday people like you, how it will impact what you can say and see online, how it could lead to us not even being able to find this podcast online. And so, that was good work with Dr. Geist. It's been downloaded by, I think, over 10,000 Canadians now. So it's free, and I would encourage people to take a look at it, because it also explains things in more clear terms that perhaps the complicated jargon, as you were just saying with one of those other soul books. But I think that's absolutely essential to understand, because this C-11 fight, it's really big, because if we can't hold the government to account anymore online through media, if we can't hold the government to account and voice our opinions, then everything else just won't matter. If we can't hold the Trudeau government to account for their reckless spending, then talking about the spending issues doesn't even matter as much. I mean, of course they're very important, but the number one thing we need to have in Canada is freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and we need to have that in order to be critical of government policy, to point out where things could and should be better and have improvement. And that's why this bill is so dangerous. And that's why I would encourage everybody to check out that ebook on censorship. Looking at anything Dr. Geist has written on this issue is very good and important as well. And of course, yes, as I said, Milton Friedman has some good stuff as well. And he pointed out that inflation, there's only one cause of inflation. It's not business, it's not labor unions, it's not taxpayers, it is the government. That's the one and only place that is causing inflation. You want to understand why we have inflation? Look to Ottawa, look to Washington, D.C., look to the capital, where deficit spending has been going on for so long, so recklessly, and that's why we're in the situation that we are. So those would be some of the recommendations on my end.
Yes, Dr. Friedman was actually spotlighted on our reading list yesterday. And of course, Dr. Soul was a student of Dr. Friedman's at the University of Chicago. And just a teaser, Dr. Friedman also has a very brilliant and not well, not talked about enough theory about the cause of the Great Depression. And that was actually caused by governments and banks, and not the quote unquote fall of the stock market. But that's a talk for another day. Jay, I want to thank you so much for being with us today. It's been an absolute pleasure. We've learned so much from you. We try to have guests on who can, talk about complex things, complicated things in a way that people can readily understand. And you really fit that bill. You really, you really came through for us today. So it's been great having you on. We want to much more success with the CTF. Keep fighting for Canadians, for fairness in our tax system. And thank you very much for being with us today on Grey Matter.
That's been my pleasure. Thank you, and great to be with you.